The encrypted drive burns in my pocket. My only ally just used her keycard to send a killer after me. The dashcam footage proves it. But if I don't move now, I'm the next corporate casualty. 50 million reasons to die. One stolen file to stay alive. And the man pouring bourbon in the next room? He's already signed my death warrant. The blue light of the workstation hummed against Marcus's retinas, vibrating in the silence of the 42nd floor. His fingers skipped across the haptic glass, diving through layers of protected payroll data until a crimson flag flickered. A document titled Executive Risk Mitigation blossomed across the screen. He leaned in, the scent of stale espresso and ozone clinging to his collar. His pulse thudded against his throat as he scrolled. Clause 14.2 sat nestled between standard liability terms. It designated David Sterling as the sole beneficiary of a key person rider. The sum, $50 million, glowed in crisp, sans serif font. The trigger condition required only a single word: accidental. Marcus gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. The wood felt cold, polished to a mirror finish. He reached into his pocket and felt the small, silver tally counter. Click. Variable 1. Financial motive for homicide. The metallic snap was tiny, a pinprick of sound in the vast, empty office. But to Marcus, it sounded like a gunshot. He traced the digital signature of his CEO, a jagged scrawl that now resembled a butcher's mark. David Sterling wasn't just his business partner. He was the man who had toasted to their shared future just 3 hours ago over a bottle of 20-year-old rye. Now, that future had a price tag, and Marcus was the currency. He began the process of copying the archives. The progress bar crawled forward, a slow blue line eating through the darkness of the screen. Every second felt like a minute. He could hear the building breathing, the groan of the steel frames settling in the Texas heat, the distant whir of the cooling fans in the server room down the hall. He clicked the counter again. Click. Variable 2. Time sensitivity. If David checked the access logs, the window of deniability would slam shut. This wasn't just a rounding error or a shell company. This was a death warrant signed in gold ink. The silence was punctured by the rhythmic thud-clack of heels on the marble floor outside. Marcus didn't flinch, but his grip tightened on the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white. The door swung open, and Sarah Miller stepped into the frame. Her sharp, angular features caught in the flickering fluorescent light of the hallway. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose with a single, rigid finger, staying exactly 3 feet from the desk, her habitual safety zone. "You are still here," she said, her voice a low, cautious monotone. She began mumbling under her breath, a rapid-fire recitation of Texas penal codes regarding unauthorized access to corporate records. It was her way of processing stress, a statutory chanting that Marcus had grown used to over the years. "I found it, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice raspy. He didn't look up from the screen. The reason the merger felt like a funeral: David hasn't just been hiding the debt. He's been betting on my expiration date. Sarah stopped her chanting. She stepped closer, breaching her 3-foot rule by an inch. "I came to tell you the board has been locked out. David issued an emergency gag order on the acquisition details. He's claiming proprietary sensitivity. But the legal framework is a mess. It's a literal cage, Marcus." Marcus pulled the encrypted thumb drive from the port. The metal bit into his palm, cold and heavy with the weight of $50 million worth of secrets. He's not just closing a deal, he's clearing the board. He reached into his pocket. Click. Variable 3. loss of institutional support. Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching for a crack in his mechanical composure. But she found only the slate-gray reflection of the monitor. Before she could respond, the lights in the hallway died. The sudden darkness was absolute, heavy as a wool blanket. Then came a sound that made Marcus's skin prickle. The sharp, metallic snap of a security door being forced open. It wasn't the clean beep of a keycard. It was the screech of a crowbar meeting a magnetic lock. "Get behind the desk," Marcus hissed. A shadow detached itself from the gloom of the doorway. It was a man, broad-shouldered and wearing a tactical mask that swallowed his features. He didn't speak. He moved with a predatory grace, his boots silent on the carpet. Marcus felt the air shift as the intruder lunged. The attack was like 1,000 fists pounding on a door at once, sudden, violent, and overwhelming. Marcus swung his arm, his hand connecting with a heavy crystal Executive of the Year award on the corner of the desk. The glass was cold and jagged. They collided. The smell of wood smoke and cheap laundry detergent rolled off the attacker. Marcus felt a sharp sting in his side as he was shoved against the workstation. The monitor flickered and died, showering the room in a brief spray of sparks. Marcus didn't scream. He reached for his tally counter. Click. Variable 4. Physical threat. He swung the crystal award with a desperate, primal strength. It caught the intruder on the side of the head with a sickening thud. The man staggered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Marcus didn't wait to see if he would get up. He grabbed Sarah by the arm, ignoring her flinch at the physical contact, and bolted for the emergency exit. Their footsteps echoed like hammer strikes in the concrete stairwell. Marcus could feel the warm dampness of blood soaking into his shirt, but his mind was already calculating the distance to the parking garage. They burst into the humid night air of the Dallas streets. Marcus's heart was a drum in his chest, vibrating against his ribs. He fumbled for his keys, his fingers numb. He shoved Sarah into the passenger seat of his sedan and tore out of the garage, the tires shrieking against the epoxy floor. He didn't look back until they were 3 miles away, lost in the river of red taillights on the I-35. Subverted beat 1.4. Marcus pulled into the back of a 24-hour diner, the neon sign buzzing like a dying insect. He needed to think. He needed to quantify. He reached for his dashboard camera, his hands finally starting to shake. "I need to see how he got in," Marcus muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. The security at Sterling Corp is a fortress. You don't just walk into the 42nd floor without a ghost in the system. He pulled the memory chip and slotted it into his laptop. Sarah sat beside him, her face pale, her lips moving in a silent prayer of corporate negligence statutes. Marcus felt a surge of professional pride. He had been smart enough to install a high-definition 360-degree camera that recorded the side entrance, the one the cleaning crews used. He had the evidence of the insurance fraud on the drive, and now he would have the face of the man who tried to kill him. This was the win. This was the variable that would put David behind bars. "Look," Marcus said, pointing at the screen. "There." A figure appeared on the grainy footage. The timestamp matched the attack perfectly. The man in the mask approached the side door. He didn't use a crowbar. He didn't smash the glass. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a slim plastic rectangle, and pressed it against the sensor. The light on the door turned from red to green, with a soft, audible chirp. Marcus zoomed in. The resolution sharpened, the pixels knitting together to form a clear image of the card. It wasn't a generic master key. It was a personalized executive badge, the gold foil of the Sterling Corp logo glinting under the street lamp. Etched into the plastic, clear as a mountain spring, was the name: Sarah Miller. Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. He didn't move, he didn't blink. The silence in the car became a physical weight, pressing against his eardrums. He had spent the last hour protecting her, bleeding for her, trusting her as his sole witness. "Sarah," he whispered. He turned his head slowly. Sarah wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at him, and for the first time, her eyes weren't twitching. The statutory chanting had stopped. The nervous, paranoid lawyer was gone. In her place sat a woman with a cold, level gaze that matched the slate gray of his own. "You were never supposed to find that filing, Marcus," she said. Her voice was no longer a monotone. It was sharp, precise, and entirely devoid of fear. "David told me you were too focused on the Singapore project to look at the riders. You're usually so predictable." Marcus reached for the door handle, but he heard the soft thunk of the electronic locks engaging. Sarah held a small remote in her hand, a signal jammer he hadn't noticed. "The drive, Marcus. Give it to me, and maybe we can talk about a different kind of retirement." Marcus looked at his tally counter. He didn't click it. For the first time in 20 years, the math didn't add up. He had accounted for the enemy in front of him, but he had ignored the one sitting in the passenger seat. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to the stomach, a hollow, cold ache that made his vision swim. He wasn't just losing his company. He had handed the keys to his own executioner. The neon light of the diner flickered, casting a sickly green glow over Sarah's face. She reached out her hand, her fingers steady. "The drive, Marcus. Don't make me call him back." Marcus realized with a jolt of pure, icy terror that the intruder hadn't failed. The attack in the office hadn't been an attempt to kill him. It had been a performance to drive him right into the one place where he felt safe. The car. With her. He was trapped in a rolling cage of his own making, and the only person he trusted was the one holding the lock. The drive to the San Juan Mountains was a funeral procession in a luxury SUV. David Sterling sat behind the wheel, his Italian loafers pressing the accelerator with a casual, rhythmic grace. He had appeared at the diner 10 minutes after Sarah's call, wearing a sympathetic frown that didn't reach his unblinking eyes. He hadn't mentioned the office attack. He hadn't mentioned the blood on Marcus's shirt. He had simply talked about security, breathing room, and the sanctity of the deal. "We just need to get above the noise, Marcus," David said, his voice flowing like a river of honey. He cracked his knuckles in his specific, rhythmic sequence: thumb, index, pinky, snap, pop, click. The city is full of ghosts right now. People whispering about the merger, people looking for cracks. We go to the cabin, we sign the final papers, and we come back as kings. Doesn't that feel like a win? Marcus sat in the back, his side throbbing. He had managed to keep the thumb drive hidden in the lining of his coat, a small lump of metal against his ribs. Sarah sat in the front passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the road, her statutory chanting replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Marcus reached into his pocket. Click. Variable 5. Total geographic isolation. They were crossing the Colorado border now, the flat Texas plains giving way to the jagged, oppressive peaks of the San Juans. The mountains looked like broken glass against the twilight sky. He leaned forward, his fingers brushing the back of the center console. He needed to disrupt the narrative. He knew the SUV's GPS was linked to the firm's main security hub. If he could disable it, if he could make the car disappear from the digital map, he might find a window to bolt. He slipped a small magnetized screwdriver from his pocket. a tool he always carried for hardware audits, and jammed it into the seam of the dashboard. There was a faint spark, a smell of scorched dust, and the navigation screen flickered to black. "Oh, Marcus," David sighed. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a father watching a child spill milk. He reached into the footwell and pulled out a heavy, silver-sided briefcase. He flipped the latches, and a row of green lights blossomed in the dark cabin. "Did you really think I'd rely on the factory satellite? This is a dedicated uplink, kid. It tracks our heartbeat, our tire pressure, and our exact coordinates within 6 inches. You can't hide from the ghost in the machine." David chuckled, a warm, rich sound that made Marcus's stomach turn. "I love your initiative, I really do. But you're playing checkers in a room full of grandmasters. Just sit back and enjoy the view. The air up here is transformative." The cabin was a monument to false comfort. It sat on a ledge of gray stone, surrounded by pines that shrieked in the rising wind. Inside, a fire crackled in a hearth made of river rock, and the smell of cinnamon and baked apples was so thick it felt like a trap. "Make yourself at home," David said, gesturing to the stairs. "Linda should have everything ready for you." Linda Evans, David's longtime assistant, appeared from the kitchen. She was smoothing her colorful scarf over her knees, her eyes darting toward the door as if looking for an exit. "I'm so sorry, Marcus," she whispered as she handed him his suitcase. "Sorry about everything." She apologized to the banister as she bumped into it, her voice a thin, shaky thread. Marcus took his bag to the guest room. The moment the door clicked shut, he dropped to his knees and unzipped the leather. His clothes had been rearranged. His socks were folded differently. His shaving kit had been opened, the seal on his aspirin bottle broken. He moved to the bedside table and picked up the heavy, antique landline phone. He pressed it to his ear. Silence. Not the hum of a dial tone, but the hollow, dead vacuum of a severed wire. He followed the cord to the wall. It hadn't been unplugged. It had been cut with a pair of industrial shears, the copper innards splayed out like a nervous system. He stood up and looked out the window. The sun had dipped behind the peaks, leaving the world in a bruised, purple shadow. He was miles from the nearest road, trapped in a house with a man who had put a price on his head and a lawyer who had already tried to collect it. Click. Variable 6. Severed communication. Click. Variable 7. Compromised perimeter. He needed leverage. He needed something more than just the insurance filing. If David was this desperate, the insurance wasn't the only crime. It was the exit strategy for a much larger failure. Marcus waited until the house fell into a heavy, artificial quiet. He slipped out of his room, his socks silent on the hardwood. He bypassed the main stairs, moving toward the rear mudroom. He could hear David in the great room, the clink of ice against glass, the low, rhythmic hum of a man who was already celebrating. Marcus stepped out into the biting cold. The wind bit into his skin, turning his breath into a ragged white plume. He made his way toward the equipment shed, a low, corrugated tin structure crouching in the shadows of the pines. He was halfway across the clearing when a sound stopped him dead. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, guttural vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself. From the darkness of the shed's overhang, a shape emerged. It was a dog, but not the kind you kept in a suburban yard. It was a Presa Canario, 150 pounds of brindle muscle and scarred ears. Its eyes caught the light from the cabin, glowing with a dull, predatory amber. David hadn't mentioned a dog. The beast didn't bark. It lowered its head, its shoulders bunching. Marcus felt the tally counter in his pocket. He didn't have time to click it. The dog lunged. It was a blur of fur and teeth. Marcus spun, his boots slipping on the frozen mud. He scrambled toward a stack of seasoned firewood, the dog's jaws snapping inches from his heel. The sound of the beast's breath was a wet, rhythmic snarl. Marcus hauled himself up the side of the shed, his fingers clawing at the rusted metal of the roof. He reached the gutter just as the dog's weight slammed into the wall below him. The corrugated tin shrieked. Marcus pulled himself onto the pitched roof, the cold metal biting into his palms. He lay there for a moment, his heart hammering against the tin, listening to the dog pace below. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The beast was circling, waiting for gravity to do its work. Marcus looked up. There was a small loft window at the peak of the shed, a wooden frame held shut by a simple latch. He crawled toward it, the wind trying to peel him off the roof. He kicked the glass in, a sharp, crystalline shatter, and tumbled into the darkness of the loft. The air inside smelled of rotted grease and old gasoline. He dropped down onto a workbench, his boots landing among rusted saws and jars of nails. He fumbled for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. He saw it almost immediately. A heavy steel toolbox sat under a pile of moth-eaten tarps. It wasn't locked with a standard key. It had a biometric pad, the kind used for high-end gun safes. Marcus remembered David's knuckles. Thumb, index, pinky. He looked at the pad. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, except for 3 spots. He pressed them in sequence. The lock clicked open with a heavy, mechanical sigh. Inside wasn't a gun. It was a physical ledger, bound in cracked black leather. Marcus flipped it open. The pages were filled with David's jagged scrawl, thousands of entries, dates, and amounts. It wasn't corporate accounting. It was a personal record of loss. The Mirage, $2.4 million. The Win, $1.8 million. Aria, $3.5 million. Marcus felt a cold clarity wash over him. David hadn't just been gambling. He had been hemorrhaging money for years. He turned to the final pages. The dates were recent, the last 3 months. There, in crisp, undeniable ink, were the transfers from the merger's escrow account. David hadn't been protecting the merger. He had already spent it. The $50 million insurance policy wasn't a bonus. It was the only way to replace the money before the auditors arrived. "You're the scapegoat, Marcus," he whispered to the empty shed. If Marcus died accidentally, David would claim Marcus had been the one embezzling. He'd use the insurance money to repay the firm, emerging as the grieving hero who saved the company from his corrupt partner. The dead don't testify. The dead don't defend their reputations. Click. Variable 8. The frame. Marcus tucked the ledger under his coat, the heavy leather pressing against his bruised ribs. He had the motive, the method, and now the proof. But as he turned toward the door, the shed's single light bulb flickered on. David Sterling stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his loafers anymore. He was in heavy hunting boots, and in his hands he held a bolt-action rifle with a polished walnut stock. "You always did have a nose for the truth, Marcus," David said. He didn't look angry. He looked almost admiring. "It's a shame. Truth is such a heavy thing to carry in a storm." He stepped into the shed, the rifle held loosely at his side. Outside, the wind had shifted. The howling had turned into a deep, bass roar. "The weather report just came in," David said, his voice bright and conversational. "A real 100-year blizzard. The roads are already white. The power will be out within the hour. No one's coming up that mountain, Marcus, and no one's going down." He cracked his knuckles. Snap, pop, click. "Now," David said, leaning in. "Why don't we go back inside and talk about your legacy?" The blizzard arrived like a physical wall. One moment, the pines were visible against the snow. The next, the world was a screaming, white void. Inside the cabin, the temperature began to drop as the wind found the cracks in the old log walls. The fire in the hearth was a frantic orange claw, fighting against the draft that whistled down the chimney. David sat in a leather wingback chair, the rifle resting across his knees. He had poured himself a glass of scotch, the amber liquid swirling as he tilted the glass. "You know, Marcus," David said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "People love a tragedy. A brilliant man, a pillar of the community, driven to madness by greed. You steal the money, you realize you can't get away with it, and you take a walk into the woods to end it all. It's poetic. It's clean." Marcus stood by the window, his hand in his pocket. Click. Variable 9. Imminent execution. He looked at Sarah, who was sitting at the dining table, her laptop open. She was drafting the press release, the one that would announce Marcus's disappearance and the discovery of the stolen funds. "You won't get away with it," Marcus said. His voice was steady, though his heart was a frantic bird against his ribs. "The math is too messy, David. You're leaving too many variables." "The math is whatever I say it is," David replied. He stood up, the rifle barrel glinting in the firelight. "Because I'm the only one left to do the counting." He walked toward Marcus, his movements slow and deliberate. "I think it's time for that walk, don't you? Before the snow gets too deep to find your body in the spring." Marcus felt a surge of cold fury. He wasn't his father. He wasn't going to be the man who lost everything because he didn't see the signs. He saw them now. He saw every jagged, bloody one of them. "I need to use the restroom," Marcus said. David hesitated, then stepped back, gesturing with the rifle. 30 seconds. Don't make me come in there. It'll be much messier for everyone." Marcus walked into the small hallway, his mind racing. He didn't go to the bathroom. He turned into David's study, a room filled with the smell of old paper and expensive tobacco. He knew David kept a satellite phone in the desk, a backup for his backup. He found it in the bottom drawer, tucked behind a stack of gambling markers. He flipped it open. The screen glowed a faint, hopeful blue. 1 bar of signal, maybe 2. He dialed Sarah's personal number. He knew her habits. She'd have her phone on the table, even now. "Sarah," he whispered when the line connected. "He's going to kill you too. You're the only witness. Once I'm gone, you're the next liability. Look at the insurance policy again. Look at the secondary rider. It's not just me. It's any key executive. That's you, Sarah." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Marcus?" Her voice was a tiny, distorted ghost in his ear. The door to the study slammed open. David was there, his face a mask of purple rage. He didn't say a word. He lunged across the room and ripped the phone from Marcus's hand. He didn't just turn it off. He swung it against the stone hearth with a violent, overhead strike. The plastic shattered, the internal battery skittering across the floor like a dead coal. "You just shortened your timeline, Marcus," David hissed. He grabbed Marcus by the collar and dragged him toward the front door. The cold hit them like a physical blow, a freezing tide that stole the breath from Marcus's lungs. David shoved him out onto the porch, the snow already 6 inches deep on the wood. "The bridge," David shouted over the wind. "We're going to the bridge. It's a 40-foot drop to the creek. The ice is thin enough to break, but thick enough to trap you underneath. It's perfect." They moved through the woods, a slow, stumbling dance. David held the rifle to Marcus's back, the cold metal pressing through his coat. The trees groaned, their branches heavy with ice, snapping like bone in the darkness. They reached the stone bridge. It was an old, arched structure that spanned a deep ravine. Below the creek was a black, churning ribbon of ice and slush. "Go on," David said, stepping back. "Make it look real. A slip, a fall. A tragic end to a tragic man." Marcus stood at the edge of the stone rail. The wind shrieked, tearing at his clothes. He looked down into the blackness. He felt the tally counter in his pocket. One more click. Click. Variable 10. The breaking point. He didn't jump. He turned. "You forgot one thing, David," Marcus said. His voice was lost in the wind, but David saw his lips move. "What's that?" David stepped forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm not the one who's trapped." Marcus lunged. He didn't go for the rifle. He went for David's lead foot. He dropped low, his shoulder hitting David's knee with the force of a man who had nothing left to lose. David screamed as his leg buckled, the rifle firing a wild, deafening shot into the sky. They grappled on the slick stone. The smell of scotch and sweat was thick in the freezing air. David was stronger, but Marcus was desperate. He clawed at David's face, his fingers finding the edge of the man's eye socket. David howled and threw Marcus off. Marcus hit the stone rail, the breath leaving his body in a painful grunt. He didn't wait. He rolled over the side, not into the water, but into the thick, snow-covered briars that clung to the side of the ravine. He tumbled down the slope, the thorns tearing at his face and hands. He hit the bottom and scrambled to his feet, his vision swimming. He could hear David shouting from the bridge, the sounds of a man who had lost his rhythm. Marcus ran. He didn't have a coat. He didn't have a plan. He only had the ledger and the drive. He sprinted through the blinding white, his lungs burning. He reached the perimeter of the property, the spot where he had parked the SUV. He just needed to get to the car. He could use the satellite briefcase to call for help. He broke through the tree line and stopped. The SUV wasn't there. Or rather, the shape of it was. But it was no longer a vehicle. It was a pyre. Orange flames licked at the falling snow, a defiant, hungry heat in the sub-zero night. The smell of burning rubber and gasoline was overwhelming. David hadn't just tracked him. He had ensured there was no way home. Marcus stood in the glow of the wreck, his hands hanging at his sides. He was miles from civilization, in the middle of a historic blizzard, with no shelter and a hunter on his trail. He looked at his hands. They were blue, the skin beginning to waxy and numb. He was effectively dead. The world would see the fire. They would find the stolen ledger in the ashes, and they would close the book on Marcus Thorne. A shot rang out. A branch inches from Marcus's head shattered, showering him with ice. David was coming. Marcus crawled into a shallow cave beneath a granite overhang. The rock was cold, but it blocked the wind. He huddled there, his body shaking so violently he could hear his teeth clicking. He looked at the ledger. It was useless now. A collection of paper in a world made of ice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his emergency pack, a small, waterproof tin he kept in his inner lining. Inside was a flare kit, a whistle, and a space blanket. He looked out at the woods. David was out there, moving through the trees, the light from his tactical flashlight cutting through the snow like a blade. "I can see your tracks, Marcus." David's voice was high, jagged with a frantic energy. "There's no point in freezing. Come out and I'll make it quick. I'll even tell them you were a genius." Marcus didn't move. He was calculating. The wind was blowing from the north, swirling in the mouth of the canyon below. If he could create a distraction. He took the flare kit. He didn't fire it into the air. He cracked the magnesium casing and buried it in a pile of dry pine needles at the mouth of the cave. Then he took his space blanket, a thin, crinkling sheet of silver, and draped it over a fallen log 20 yards away, in the opposite direction. He retreated further into the shadows. The magnesium ignited with a brilliant, blinding white hiss. Thick, chemical smoke began to pour out of the cave, caught by the wind and dragged down into the canyon. "Found you!" David shouted. Marcus watched as the flashlight beam raced toward the smoke. David burst into the clearing, the rifle raised to his shoulder. He saw the silver reflection of the space blanket on the log and fired. Crack, crack, crack. The bullets tore through the thin plastic. David lunged forward, ready to finish it. He never saw the wire. Marcus had stripped the copper from the severed phone line in the cabin. He had strung it 6 inches off the ground between 2 saplings. David's boot caught the wire. He went down hard, his face hitting a jagged rock with a sickening crunch. The rifle flew from his hands, sliding across the ice and disappearing into a deep drift of snow. David tried to get up, but he screamed, a high, thin sound that was swallowed by the storm. A heavy pine log, loosened by the wind and David's own weight, had shifted from the slope above. It slid down, pinning David's legs against the frozen earth. Marcus stepped out of the shadows. He looked like a ghost, his skin white with frost, his eyes sunken and dark. He walked over to David, who was gasping, his face a mask of blood and mud. "The Sarah Miller keycard was a nice touch, David," Marcus said. His voice was a raspy whisper. "But you forgot that I don't just count the variables. I audit them." He leaned down, his face inches from David's. "I didn't just call Sarah on that phone. I activated my dead man's switch. Every file on that drive, the insurance, the ledger, the embezzlement, was auto-forwarded to the FBI's white-collar division at 8 p.m. tonight. If I don't check in by midnight, the servers release the encryption keys." David's eyes widened. You're bluffing." "I don't bluff," Marcus said. "I calculate, and right now, your value is 0. The sound of a heavy, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the floor of the canyon. It wasn't the wind. It was the beat of rotor blades. A search and rescue helicopter, alerted by the automated SOS from the satellite phone's interrupted signal, was cresting the ridge. Subverted beat 4.4. 2 weeks later, the Sterling Corp boardroom was silent. The smell of ozone and industrial bleach was still there, but the air felt different, thinner, colder. Marcus Thorne sat at the head of the mahogany table. His arm was in a sling, and a jagged scar ran across his cheek, but his suit was perfectly pressed. Across from him sat David Sterling, flanked by 2 federal agents. David looked small. His tan had faded, and his hands were cuffed to the chair. "Sign it," Marcus said. He pushed a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a transfer of ownership. It ceded every share, every asset, and every intellectual property right of Sterling Corp to Marcus Thorne for the sum of $1. David looked at the paper. His eyes were hollow. "You won, Marcus. You have the company. You have the money. Just let it go." "Sign it," Marcus repeated. David took the pen. His hand shook, the jagged scrawl of his signature looking like a dying thing on the page. The agents led him away, the rhythmic clink of the handcuffs the only sound in the room. Marcus was alone. He looked around the boardroom. This was what he had wanted. Total control. No variables he couldn't quantify. No partners to betray him. He was the ultimate strategist, the man who had outplayed the world. He reached into his pocket for his tally counter. He wanted to click it. He wanted to reach 10. He wanted to feel that surge of safety, that mathematical certainty that he was okay. He pulled the counter out and looked at it. The silver was tarnished. He pressed the button. Click. The sound was hollow. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like a door closing in an empty house. He thought of his father. He thought of the man who had lost everything because he didn't see the signs. Marcus had seen every sign. He had accounted for every betrayal. And in doing so, he had ensured that there was no one left to betray him. He looked at the empty chair where David had sat. He thought of Sarah, who was currently in a federal holding cell. He thought of Robert Chen, the ghost of the office, who had looked at Marcus with terror when Marcus had ordered the final liquidation of David's estate. Marcus reached for the phone on the desk. He wanted to call someone, not for a deal, not for an audit, just to talk. He realized he didn't have a single number in his personal contacts that wasn't a strategic asset. He stood up and walked to the window. Dallas stretched out below him, a sea of lights and data points. He had saved the company. He had reclaimed his stolen assets. He had won the game. But as he stood there, the silver counter heavy in his hand, Marcus Thorne realized the ultimate variable he had failed to account for. Control isn't safety. It's just a different kind of cage. He clicked the counter again. Click. Variable 11. The cost of the win. The math was perfect. The ledger was balanced. And Marcus Thorne was the loneliest man in the world. The end.